Operation GCD with an Appalachian grin. Adventures and shenanigans, we're diving right in. Out in the holler where the secrets creep, garbage can dudes digging mighty deep. Secret societies, shadows in the pines. Operation GCD of American rebels design. Double J searching deep in his brain hole, past layers of melted hops and bone resin. From cults to cover-ups, we're talking about all of that. So watch your sixth friend and the truth we trust. The world's a puzzle, grunge rock ain't what it seems. Ancient alien cargo cults haunt the moon's pale beams. Cincinnati schemers, history's a haze. Double J's on the mic, lighting things ablaze. Operation GCD with an Appalachian grin. Adventures and shenanigans, we're diving right in. Join us on the journey and enjoy the show. Thanks for joining us to get a little GC. Hey, world's a puzzle, grunge rock ain't what it seems. Ancient alien cargo cults haunt the moon's pale beam. Cincinnati schemers, history's a haze. Double J's on the mic, lighting things ablaze. Hell, the world's a puzzle, grunge rock ain't what it seems. Ancient alien cargo cults haunt the moon's pale beams. Cincinnati schemers, history's a haze. Double J's on the mic, lighting things ablaze. Double J's on the mic, lighting things ablaze.
Boom! Howdy, folks. Your host, Double J, back here, coming at you live from my studio / RV dining room, located directly inside America. Anyhow, folks of the interwebs, once again, Double J back here, your host, and more importantly, not the vice president. And however, I will be your pilot and navigator here tonight for this shenanigan-infused journey into the mind of this particular garbage can dude. So, welcome back, folks of the interwebs, and thanks again for joining me here tonight to get a little GCD. Got a real barn burner on deck for you folks. One of my favorite games here that I like to play at Operation GCD. You know, it's in part a game and in part what I can help to do in my part to help humanity. You know, kind of my make-a-wish for actor, Kevin Bacon, who, apparently has been plagued by this 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon game for many years, for a few decades now, and has requested folks come up with a new Patsy. So, in that effort to help, like I said, a make-a-wish style for Kevin Bacon, I like to do, Westchester time. This actually goes back to Westchester tonight, and why wouldn't it? With tonight's tale. But usually I like to play this game with Charles Manson. I like to joke around that Charles Manson is as much of a part of American folklore and Americana as apple pie and baseball. So I don't think tonight's subject is quite as rooted in such folklore and Americana. Mr. Bob Cocaine Evans, legendary Hollywood producer, and I'm not sure if he knew Chuck, but they certainly ran in the same circles. So probably, I like to strongly suspect that old Bob Cocaine Evans and Charles Manson, they crossed paths, given their friends and social circles and proclivities in life, largely revolving around drugs, stuff. And again, he was the Manson family murders, or the Tate Polanski house there, and it's It's old Bob Cocaine Evans that brokered that marriage between his pal Roman Polanski and his pal Sharon Tate, the director and actress there. Polanski and Evans were they started a number of projects when Evans took over Paramount Pictures. Not the least of which was and I believe it was actually the second film that Evans did, but it was that satanic shitstorm of a cinematic shitstorm, a lot of shitstorms. Rosemary's Baby. So that was very much a Bob Cocaine Evans and Polanski project. Bob was routinely reported to be on set there at the Dakota Building during the filming of that. The Dakota Building that would later serve as the site of a processed church murder of a different variety than the Manson murders, and that is the murder of Beatles singer John Lennon would be murdered outside the steps of the Dakota Building, the same building that Rosemary's Baby here and Bob Cocaine Evans and gang were involved with, about a decade prior. So I won't belabor the point any further, folks of the interwebs here. We'll let actor Kevin Bacon himself kick us off here for tonight's shenanigan infused game of 6 Degrees of Bob Cocaine Evans.
The 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. In case you haven't heard of this game, the idea is that any actor, alive or dead, can be connected to me through our work in 6 steps or less. How did all this start? In 1994, I'm minding on my own business. I'm making movies. I'm trying to raise my family. And I don't remember exactly how I first heard about it, but it just kind of started to seep into my life. People would come up to me and say things like, my cousin made up a game about you. Or, dude, I'm so hungover, man. I was in a bar last night, and we were playing your game. I got shit-faced, and I'm a mess. I was absolutely horrified. I was furious. But I stopped, and I said to myself, sometimes you have to confront your demons. Sometimes you got to face the beast. So I said, I'm going to go in, and I'm going to look these guys in the eyes. I'm going to say, listen, fellas, get another Patsy, okay? Find somebody else.
Yep. You asked for Kevin Bacon, 6 Degrees of Bob Cocaine Evans. So we'll help. Well, like I said, I like to help out humanity here. Make a wish for actor Kevin Bacon style. Help him find a new Patsy. And we got a list of them here tonight with Bob Cocaine Evans. No different than Charles Manson. Both of these fellas have extensive networks. Obviously, the original Kevin Bacon game is films that he acted with folks in, and I threw in a couple of those examples tonight. But more or less, these are associations of friendship or business related, more so social and friendship, or what I would assert is most likely cult related, is the organizing principle for most of these folks here tonight around Mr. Bob Cocaine Evans. And before we go off on that journey here, folks, if y'all aren't familiar with old Bob and some of his activities, besides the producer of Rosemary's Baby, he produced The Godfather 2. I don't believe he was credited for Godfather 3. I believe he sold off his rights by that point in time and was not associated with the project. But Godfather 3 is an interesting project because the Michael Corleone character is basically doing a lot of the things that Bob's boss did there. A man by the name of Charles Bluedhorn. So a lot of the character aspects seen in Godfather 3 were actually real life events in the life of Charles Bluedhorn, but portrayed as in the life of Michael Corleone. This is matters relative to the Vatican bank scandal, some real estate, some real estate businesses with the Vatican folks. So, Bob knows a lot of weird folks, that's for sure. Actually, the president. He's most notably again is the legendary Hollywood producer. I'm sure without we'll bring up a quick list while I'm jibber jabbing around here for what films he did besides Rosemary's Baby and his long list of other films is Godfather, Chinatown. He had a resurgence later on because he obviously met some troubles in the early 80s and he got arrested for cocaine trafficking in 1980 along with his brother, Charles Evans. They're an interesting bunch because they started off selling women's clothing and then Bob was a kind of started off as a extra and kind of a character actor in Hollywood, where he would befriend folks like George Hamilton. If any folks of the interwebs are familiar with the old actor George Hamilton, I'm not even sure if he's still alive. Lord of mercy, he is. Okay, good for him. So this kind of this very tanned look of this that Hamilton's classic for, with the slick back hair and the skin of a hot dog. That's him actually doing a parody of his pal Bob Cocaine Evans. So they kind of came up in Hollywood together. That's where Bob started. But he was selling women's clothing with his brother from New York. They're from New York. Their mother's from Westchester County. Mentioned that before. We'd be jumping off the journey there. So as I've advocated in the past, if nuclear weapons were real, I would advocate for the annihilation of that entire place. It's a den of iniquity, if you ask me. But Bob Cocaine Evans' family actually he's got folks, his mother's family still resides there, and prominent members of the business community, if you will. So, but yeah, it's kind of funny how much, if you haven't heard the name Bob, you've probably seen him before, because not only did George Hamilton do a little parody or satirical performance of his buddy Bob, so did old cocaine Bob's friend Dustin Hoffman. No, I didn't include Hoffman in tonight's journey of the 6 degrees, but if you've ever seen the film Wag the Dog, you've seen Bob Cocaine Evans. That's Hoffman's satirical take on Bob Cocaine Evans. And in fact, I think that film's a satirical take on the real life events of Bob Cocaine Evans and his long time, very strange, as strange as the photo as seen on tonight's cover image, with shirtless Bob hugging on Henry Kissinger. They had a very multi-decades, very strange relationship. Tabloids would write, well, why do these folks know each other? And Kissinger was the special guest of Bob's at the Godfather premiere of the film, The First Godfather, and that made a lot of tabloid hullabaloo. Asking why, how do these folks know each other? Why are they buddies? And I think it's a great question, but I couldn't tell you other than sounds kind of culty. So y'all have probably seen Bob Evans, old cocaine Bob Evans. I apologize. You just didn't quite realize it. And again, he's done a lot of other films besides the ones that are the most notable. Again, he again, his resurgence. So he gets busted for the cocaine in 1980. Somehow walks. Doesn't do any time. He does public safety announcements saying, don't do cocaine. You shouldn't do cocaine. And which is it's just ridiculous. But you look at a lot of these process folks. So it seems, according to the research of Maury Terry and what Bob was up to in the cocaine, that's a different story altogether. But Bob seemed to have been around a lot of cocaine and murder in the 80s, even after he got busted. Again, did no time. He would later do an interview saying that he would forever be known as Bob Cocaine Evans. And I, once again, in my effort to help humanity, I don't want to, I'd like to honor the dying, he died a few years back, Bob did. So I'd like to honor a dying man's wishes and continue on his legacy by calling him by the name he chose, Bob Cocaine Evans. And Lord of mercy, there's a lot of cocaine around this bunch. And again, Maury Terry associated that with this cocaine stuff going on around the Roy Raiden murder, and Bob's indicted conspirator, a woman by the name of Laney Jacobs, was what she went by at the time. Her real name was Karen Greenberger, and she was actually married to the #1 Medellin drug cartel dude in America. So you had Pablo Escobar and Carlos Later, and they're the founders of the Medellin cartel out of Colombia, and their #1 dude in America was a fellow by the name of Larry Greenberger. He's murdered on his porch about 6 months after he's identified as the #1 Medellin guy in America in a court proceedings in the Carlos Later trial. Again, Carlos Later being Pablo Escobar's associate. You're probably familiar with this tale, folks of the interwebs, if you've seen the movie Blow, starring Johnny Depp. So that's this whole tale of the Medellin cartel around the fellow by the name of George Young. So George Young would have been an associate of Larry Greenberger. In fact, when Young would go to prison earlier in the 80s, I suspect it was Greenberger that was part of that coup within the Medellin cartel to put him there, because it is Greenberger that seized power within that network. Again, identified in 87 as the Medellin's #1 dude in America, and then popped in the back of his, a couple times in the back of the head while sitting on his porch in Lake Okeechobee. He's from a wealthy family of the Lake Okeechobee, Florida area. In fact, they just opened up that murder again, and allegedly Karen Greenberger sitting in prison in California for life from the Roy Raden murder, the one that Bob skirted on. Again, Bob likes to skirt charges, the cocaine, the murder. But she's got no mugshot, so I presume she's sitting in there. But nonetheless, she's also under investigation, according to reports last year, maybe 2 years ago now, under reports stating that they've opened up that case and she's the suspect in her husband's murder. Again, a murder no one's really cared to solve since 87, because, again, this is the Medellin cartel's #1 dude. This is all Iran-Contra stuff. This is all the cocaine that was getting funneled in for Iran-Contra. So I'll get into a little bit more of that here, but my point being here, folks of the interwebs, I appreciate you allowing me to belabor this point, is you've heard of Bob Cocaine Evans, whether you've heard of him or not. He's out there, folks. George Hamilton's doing satire on him. Dustin Hoffman, his friends are. In fact, when Bob would go see Wag the Dog at the premiere, I think it was 97, he was questioned while walking out of the theater, what'd you think of the film? And his reply was, I thought I looked great on the big screen, because he was referencing, Hoffman obviously playing the part there. But, that was kind of Bob's thing. He always wanted to get on the big screen and kind of failed in that regard. So there was some elements of Bob's life I don't think he quite achieved, but he achieved a lot nonetheless. Murder, cocaine trafficking, and that's probably only some of the few things. But again, cocaine trafficking seems to be one of the popular aspects of all these folks' activities, right? They're always within this Bob Cocaine, Evans network of situations. So again, got identified. I left a few of the other characters. There's so many characters. I can include so many characters. Again, Dustin Hoffman and all other folks like that on that level of associations with Bob. But I identified 6 characters for tonight's game, and 6 folks that directly knew and socially and or cult wise and or worked with Bob, as in Bob hired them or they hired Bob, Cocaine Bob, that is. That's the first degree. So that would get you a Cocaine Bob score of 1. For example, like I said, he hired Roman Polanski, as for directing Rosemary's Baby, and that was one of Bob's first acts is being hired as the head of Paramount Pictures. In fact, I think the other one was already in the works. So I think that was technically his first greenlit film. So that's one example. And again, like I said, Bob was on the set a lot at that film. And I believe it was 1967 when it was filming there at the Dakota Building. And also on that set and in that film was none other than Sammy Davis Jr. And Sammy Davis Jr., he's a real colorful character. But instead of starting off with Polanski, we'll start off on Jr., because old Sammy Davis Jr., he's first of all, he's a very unorthodox character compared to most folks of society. If you want to compare him to his demographics or age groups or whatever comparison you want to make, he's a black fellow who converted to Judaism, who then later converted to the Church of Satan, and apparently was a prolific recruiter for the Church of Satan in Hollywood. If you ask folks like Eddie Murphy, and I got a clip on that here in a second, but so Sammy Davis Jr. here, again, hired by Roman Polanski and Bob Cocaine Evans for for his role there in Rosemary's Baby, and he again, prolific Satanist. Here he is with I believe this was before Aquino left the Church of Satan, so I believe he was the number 2 guy here on the left, Michael Aquino. His eyebrows don't look as nefarious in this, but you can see them; they're a little bit nefarious looking. And then you got Anton LaVey here. Maybe they had a little Jewish partnership going too, because again, LaVey being, from a Jewish background, raised in Judaism, and Sammy Davis a convert to Judaism. I just find that's, again, he's a very colorful character, this Sammy Davis. He is definitely creepy. I could not agree with you more, Desert Rain. He's a creepy fella. And it's not even just necessarily my estimations, because if you want to hear a story about how creepy he was, or just how much he loved cocaine, let me help you out with that. And a couple years ago, maybe a year or two ago, I think it was, the Comedians in Cars with Coffee, I believe it is, with Jerry Seinfeld, who, by the way, was a Scientologist. I'm not sure if he still is, but he certainly credits Scientology for helping launch his, helping him, giving him the abilities and confidence to get up on stage and have a successful stand-up comedy career. So whether or not he's still a Scientologist, I couldn't tell you. I don't think Xenu likes it if you leave, though. But a lot of cocaine in the Sammy Davis situation from all angles, in fact. But here's Sammy Davis talking about him, or I'm sorry, disregard. Yeah, here's the ghost of Sammy Davis, along with Jim Morrison and the Naked Indian, talking about cocaine. Now here's that was the Dream from Wayne's World 2. Here's Sammy Davis and Jerry Seinfeld talking about cocaine, and disregard Eddie Murphy and Jerry Seinfeld talking about cocaine and Sammy Davis.
You know what I realized about Sammy? That was coke. The whole thing with the mouth like this.
It was?
Think about it. That whole era is cocaine.
I don't know anything
Sammy
about drugs.
is like this with that cocaine mouth, man, and the way he would laugh and hug and all that. He was totally coked up. That was all cocaine, man. That was a cocaine thing.
So I strongly suspect old Sammy Davis Jr. and Cocaine Bob here did a significant amount of powder together, with one another on the Rosemary's Baby set, probably a little bit afterwards, because Sammy Davis was rolling around in coke as late as the early 80s when he's busted on the, well, he's not busted. The fella producing that film is busted on the set of that film, Knights of the City. And that fellow is Michael Franchise, the former capo from the Colombo crime family and son of the underboss of the Colombo crime family. But I'm jumping ahead a little bit because I first wanted to talk about, before we start talking about Michael Franchise and his other associations here, because he would have a Cocaine Bob score of 2, So that's when you're dancing around this much cocaine from multiple angles, and then you're also associated with Cocaine Bob, well, it doesn't bode well for you. It doesn't look like, it's not a favorable look. It's not a good look. But here's Eddie Murphy talking about how Sammy Davis Jr. tried to recruit him into Satanism.
Sammy told me he worshiped the devil. We were in Dan Tana's on that restaurant with all the pictures up. Sammy was like, Satan is as powerful as God. And I was like, what the fuck are you talking about? He says, why do you think there's so much anger in the world and killing and murder and Satan? And he saw my reaction to it, and he kind of lightened up on it. And he was like, in Dan Tana's, it's dark, and it's the candles on the table, and Sammy's face over the candle. Satan is as powerful as God. Sammy Davis and that kind of shit, They were still around.
What was he like?
Just like you would expect him to be.
Cool. He's a hep cat, right?
Just like he.
So it sounds like Eddie Murphy may have turned that down, but at least in that retelling of events, however, that offer that is, maybe that was an offer he could refuse. But you fast forward a few years later, so that must have happened in the 80s, probably mid 80s, I presume. Sammy Davis is dead by 91, but I presume that Eddie may have been involved in some similar type activities, right? Or maybe went there eventually, because he had a real transgendered prostitutes situation popping off in the mid to late 90s. In fact, a number of those transgender prostitutes that he would allegedly be associated with, according to some publications that were and investigatory reports, like some investigatory journalism that I guess it was conducted on the early interwebs. Really, it's called a site called Big Hollywood, run by Andrew Breitbart, the conservative media fellow that had a mysterious death later. But yeah, in the 90s, he was doing something called Big Hollywood and writing on basically almost like a pre-TMZ type of deal, but seemingly somewhat more informational. But yeah, the apparently according to his series he did, old Eddie Murphy had a little bit of a problem with some transgender prostitutes, not just that one. And, a couple of them, they're met an untimely demise when folks started asking questions. So maybe he dodged Satan's bullets that time with Sammy Davis, and maybe they got him later. I don't know. I wasn't there. However, Michael Franchise, though, is back to Michael Franchise. So if you folks of the interwebs are familiar with him, like I said, capo of the Colombo crime family, he would later produce a movie in the 80s starring Sammy Davis Jr. called Knights of the City. That film, Franchise would be arrested at the wrap-up party for the film down in Miami. And I got a video for us on that in a moment here as well. In fact, let me I got a video to introduce the man. Let me just hit play right.
Filed in federal court, Michael Franzese is now a high-ranking member of an organized crime family, the Colombo Mafia family, and was recently charged with racketeering, extortion, loan sharking, and the investment of mafia money in legitimate business. Authorities say the power behind Franzese and Zimmerman in the movie business is Michael Franzese's father, John Sonny Franzese, one of the top mafia bosses in the country, who was released from prison just last month and met at the prison gate by his son Michael. Federal authorities say Michael Franzese is not the first member of his father's crime family to go into the motion picture business. The elder Franzese and his mob associates were the men behind the distribution of a number of sex and violence films, including Deep Throat and Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which made millions for the mob. Filed in federal court, Michael Franzese is now a high-ranking...
Well, so that's a little bio on the background of Michael Franzese, and it's notable that the films that his father was reported as financing there, both the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and more notably the Deep Throat, the Sanders that premiered at a Process Church owned and operated pornography theater in West Hollywood, the Pussycat Theater, I believe it was named. So you have some very interesting Process connections there, if you ask me. If it's Colombo crime family, Bob Cocaine Evans friends, the Colombo crime family. So it's really, if you want to look at the Godfather films, Joe Colombo and the Colombo crime family are more they should have gotten a credit for executive producer, is what I'm saying. So they're just as much an executive producer of that film as the CIA fellow from the Rand Corporation, Al Ruddy, and his friend Cocaine Bob. So Cocaine Bob was the head of Paramount, but he was also going to get his name on that big screen. You know what I mean? Putting his name up there as the executive producer. So he got that credit. So he seemed to be tight with the Colombos, this Bob Cocaine Evans. So it's not that really much of a mystery to me to see, a capo and son of the underboss of the Colombos associating with the likes of more of Bob Cocaine Evans' friends, right? Such as not only, but one example of Sammy Davis Jr. So, and it was at I believe it was 1983, he gets busted in Miami, Michael Franchise, as he's the executive producer of another film, Knights of the City, starring Sammy Davis Jr. This was such a cocaine-fueled disaster, apparently. Franchise gets arrested as the executive producer of the film. He's arrested at the premiere or the wrap-up of filming. He is not involved in the rest of the production. So that, as the executive producer, he would have been, but he's in prison or in jail waiting trial, and the film's being, post-production. And somehow the movie studio, I believe it was Disney, Touchstone Pictures, maybe, I forget, one of those Disney subsidiaries, and they decided to cut Sammy Davis Jr. from the entire film. So whatever cocaine fueled nightmare that was that Franchise and Davis Jr. cooked up down there in Miami, I have no idea. But when folks got some objective non-cocaine fueled eyes on it, they said, look, this dog shit film, we got to take Sammy Davis Jr. out of it altogether. And I'm sure someone in the room said, he's the star, we can't do that. Like, look, it's fucking terrible. So I've actually never seen the film. You can go to Michael Franchise today is out of prison. He runs a YouTube channel. It's actually must-see TV if you ask me. So one of the funniest things I like to watch on there is when him and Sammy the Bull Gravano of Gambino family capo. Apparently they don't like each other too much, but there's hours of them two yelling at just back and forth, just hollering at each other that they're both calling each other both a rat. Now, apparently they both ratted, according to court documents, they both ratted folks out. So, it's must-see TV to see two old mobsters screaming on YouTube at each other that they're both rats. Like, what does this world come to here? Back there was once upon a time, like, these folks operated in secret. We don't really know who these mobsters are. Hoover would deny them even after the Kennedy assassination. There's a hearing in Congress in March of '64, and J. Edgar Hoover saying, "What organized crime? What Cosa Nostra?" This is after the Appalachian meeting. RFK's in there as the Attorney General saying, "You mean the Appalachian meeting? That happened years prior." And so, there's been a long standing orders not to identify these organized crime elements. Largely, obviously, Italian. Not the only ones. There's organized crime elements that are of other nationalities. I'm well aware of that don't get recognized as well. But nonetheless, what we're talking about here is the Cosa Nostra, and so it's odd to me that they have this this bond of secrecy, and then fast forward a few years, and they're going to scream at each other on YouTube about being rats. And comically, they seem to be both rats. So it's must-see TV if you ask me. But Michael Franchise, for folks aware of the Son of Sam community, may be aware that he visited David Berkowitz there about a year ago. And I have lost track of the chat. That is an accurate analysis. So he's visited David Berkowitz. Like I said, he's got some long-term associations with these kind of folks, as in and of itself, right? Because Berkowitz is, tells stories of the process and his associations there, and so when I see Michael Franchise visiting him, Sammy Davis's friend, Bob Cocaine Evans, score of 2. When I see him visiting David Berkowitz in prison, I'm like, what's going on here? So, just to make that point about this cocaine-fueled nightmare film of Knights of the City in Miami, I have this this video clip right here.
On location in Miami with the movie Cry of the City, Michael Franchise was accepted as a big-time Hollywood producer, and his partner, Jerry Zimmerman, even took to directing the actors and dancers.
Let's get our heart in it last night. Let's go. Come on.
Authorities said that Franchise's and Zimmerman's effort to make a feature-length musical and not a sex film or a violence film is a big move for mobsters to get into the more respectable aspects of the movie business. As Hollywood producers, Zimmerman and Franchise became celebrities in Miami. The Miami bishop gave them a special blessing from the Vatican. And to the astonishment of federal agents, the mayor of Miami Beach gave Franchise the keys to the city and a special police pass.
Our police department, as well as the rest of the city, is delighted to have you, and any courtesies that they can extend to you, they will be happy to do so.
The mayor later told NBC News he was shocked to hear allegations of Franchise's organized crime connections. In an interview after the movie's cast party, Zimmerman stormed off when the subject of his police record came up. Franchise calmly denied that he or the movie had any ties to the mob.
The FBI says you're a member of the Colombo Mafia family.
Like I said, the FBI can allege and say whatever they like. They've been doing it for many, many years. But what could I say? That's the FBI. That's law enforcement.
But 2 weeks later, Michael Franchise's career as a movie producer was interrupted, and he was in handcuffs, arrested by the FBI on racketeering charges.
My favorite part is how the mayor's like, "Oh, I had no idea he was a high-ranking mobster." It's classic tale. Classic tale. Just like I said, the other classic tale is we don't even know each other. It's always the claims. So yeah, Michael Franchise apparently knew, maybe old friend of David Berkowitz, because about the same age actually. In fact, Franchise, I believe, was inducted into the Mafia Hall of Fame, or whatever they call that, in October 31st, 1976. Strange date. the reason I think that I even know that is because the New York Times almost posted like an advertisement in '75, like, "Hey, the mafia's opened their books again." Like that's it. You can. I'm not making that. I can't make this stuff up. The New York Times article literally ran an article saying like, the mafia's books had been closed. They'd closed off new membership following the Appalachian meeting I previously mentioned, circa 1957, and then the first mafia war where that Joe Gallo fella and some other crazy folks were murking mob bosses. Joe Gallo comes back to play again because he's apparently behind the murking of Joe Colombo. I believe Gallo was a Gambino guy. Joe Colombo in the during the Godfather production, the first filming of Godfather, gets shot, but he doesn't die for years later. But it is interesting because at that very same time, that Bob Cocaine Evans is making The Godfather, along with the likes of, again, mob boss Joe Colombo assisting in that process as a more or less an executive producer. Al Pacino, whose career has been not only made by Bob Cocaine Evans, but made by the film The Godfather. He actually got signed over to an MGM project. And they were going to have to they had backfilled him on The Godfather with De Niro playing Michael Corleone in the first one. And apparently old Bob Cocaine Evans had to trade him to made a deal with the MGM head of MGM to trade him, trade projects. So he traded De Niro for Pacino because he wanted Pacino the entire time, but couldn't get a deal done before Pacino signed somewhere else. So with another project. So that other project though was a comedy gangster film based upon the life of Joe Gallo, who had just recently got out of prison from his previous murking of mob bosses and would cause the mob to close books for new membership. So MGM is making a film about Joe Gallo. At the same time, Bob Cocaine Evans is making The Godfather. And Joe Colombo is, again, assisting in that process with Bob there. Bob get him off this project onto that project. And this Joe Gallo character, who's the biopic, character of the other film from MGM, which came out starring Jerry Orbach and Robert De Niro and a couple other characters, came out contemporary to The Godfather. That's about Joe Gallo, who then orders a hit on Joe Colombo while these films are being made. So I don't know what all is going on there, folks of the interwebs. It's probably too many degrees of cocaine, Bob, if you ask me, or maybe just too much cocaine, but it is very odd nonetheless. So the Colombos, the Franchisi folks, that is, he was a capo. His father was a long time underboss for that family and a very well-respected man, apparently, across the mafia families, where he would settle, if other mafia families needed something settled, they would call in old John Sonny Franchise, who actually, he just died a few years ago, like apparently 100 plus. Like he was such an old mobster, he knew Capone. Like that's the level, that's the age of mobster that dude was. So that's Michael Franchise, again, new / possibly old friend of David Berkowitz, Colombo dude. If you ask Sammy Gravano, he's a rat. If you ask Michael Franchise, he's a rat. You all be the judge. He's got Oh, am I back? I think I cut out there. Am I back? All right, I think I'm back. That's not it. So the next character on the list was the same fellow we saw old shirtless Bob posing with on the cover of the artwork for tonight's show. And that is, I'm back. All right, nice. Cut out there for a second. I see that now. Awesome. Yeah, so the next fellow on the list here tonight is Henry Kissinger. We see a shirtless Bob hugging up on old Henry Kissinger. Yes, for sure. The offer. Thanks, Jonah. Yep. The offer is about the parent. It's actually the Paramount Plus mini series based upon the making of the film The Godfather. It's a very, very interesting look there. So thanks, Jonah, for that recommendation. I highly recommend folks check that one out if they want to see some more of the background on this Godfather production. Al Ruddy, the guy who just came over from the Rand Corporation, the CIA, if you will, and decided he was going to produce the TV series Hogan's Heroes, and then went on to just suddenly be this magnificent movie producer, first film is The Godfather. It's a huge success. He would later intersect Al Ruddy, that is Bob's co-executive producer in The Godfather. He would later intersect Bob's protege later in life in the production, in the creation of a lot of television programs in the 1990s. And we'll get to that in a minute. A fellow by the name of Barry Diller. Him and Al Ruddy intersect in the 90s. This is the early 70s we're talking with old Al in the production of The Godfather. So yeah, Henry Kissinger. No one could really ever explain why him and Bob were friends. Like I said, they're often seen together in all sorts of social environments. He was made a big ruckus when he came to the premiere of The Godfather. And but you can just search Bob Evans and Henry Kissinger and find a number of black tie affair type of pictures, if you will. They're all suited up here with some tuxedos and looking real fancy. This one must have been pre-1970 because I think that's Ally McGraw there. That was his wife at the time. She would later leave him for Steve McQueen in a film that was produced by Paramount. It was a Paramount film that she started with Steve McQueen, and then she left Bob, old cocaine Bob, there for McQueen. Now McQueen was supposed to be a victim at the Tate Plansky house. He allegedly met a lady at the gas station that night and find himself some other activities, but he was on his way over to the Tate Plansky house, as the legend goes. But there's cocaine Bob and Henry Kissinger doing Lord knows what together. But Lord knows what they did in the picture on tonight's cover for tonight's show, because I don't know what went on that show. I mean, I don't have a lot of shirtless friends with my hetero dude friends. You know what I mean? So I don't know. Just saying. So obviously Henry Kissinger, a major figure in all things national security. So if you want to talk about the stamping things national security, which is what I allege goes on around these processing and satanic drug trafficking cults and networks and murders, right? The man who can do that is Henry Kissinger. So there's very few folks that have been stamping things matters of national security. So I don't know if a lot of folks of the interwebs quite realize this, but America allegedly has freedom of speech. However, we lost that here in America. I mean, you can argue probably before that, I suppose, if you wanted to, but we, legally speaking, we lost that in 1947. The National Security Act of 1947 basically, completely eradicates free speech in America, because you can't have free speech unless you know what's going on in America, and you can't know what's going on in America when there's a small group of folks who've been stamping things matters of national security. A small team of folks working out of the White House, calling themselves the National Security Council. Folks have been led through numerous presidencies by folks such as Henry Kissinger and his pal Nelson Rockefeller. The guy who was not elected as VP, forced in there, and then suddenly two Manson girls, Charles Manson, two Manson girls try to murk Gerald Ford, the president, within 3 weeks of each incident in California. These things should not be looked at as coincidence. And again, Nelson Rockefeller, he's another stamper. He'd been stamping things national security since the early 50s when he was a U.S. Army intelligence officer. U.S. Army intelligence, it's an ongoing trend here in these narratives as well. So Henry Kissinger, very much one of the focal points until his death, really. In fact, he was the senior advisor to basically every president. Trump and him seemed to have some beefs. He seemingly wasn't an advisor to Trump, but he was to every Democratic president, at least. I'm not sure his and Bush's relationship either, because, well, they had one. I don't think that was the, he was, not every Democrat. So he was, let's see, he was not Carter's advisor by any means, because that was Zbigniew Brzezinski, but Brzezinski was like Kissinger's underling. So, he's advising Reagan. I guess he was advising Bush, Clinton, Obama. Yeah. So basically everybody. Yeah. Damn near everybody. So Kissinger's had his, his dark overlord, hands and all these kind of things. And then his underling, his protege. So, again, it's weird that he would have that relationship with Bob, right? So you got his protege, Brent Scowcroft, who was so Kissinger gets fired, I think, with Nixon. and then he becomes the national security advisor for a while, running that National Security Council, and then again they get out. For the Carter administration, you get Brzezinski again, who's like a Kissinger underling, and then Brzezinski's deputy, strangely enough, he endorsed the Zizian's attorney for mayor of Los Angeles last year. So the dark Sith Lord himself, Jack Lasota, the head of the Zizian homicidal vegan AI focused Silicon Valley based rationalist transgender death cult. They've murdered folks in a lot of states. They've murdered folks in California, Pennsylvania. They murked a border patrol officer in Vermont. A lot of weird stuff going on there. But their attorney that helped old Jack Lasota, the Sith Lord, seemingly appears to have helped him fake his first death. He's faked his death a couple times. Helped him fake his first death. That fella ran for mayor in Los Angeles for the Green Party. Got a lot of votes. Was a contender. I mean, not really a contender, but as far as getting votes goes, he got a few 100,000. One of the men that endorsed him was the deputy national security advisor to Brent Scowcroft. That same attorney also deeply, and I mean I couldn't stress more, deeply involved in process church activities. So that attorney is also a experimental filmmaker, right? His mentor is John Waters, OG process member John Waters, right? You can see John Waters, talk about that for himself in the 2016 process documentary by the Satanic Temple, who they claim that they're not processed. Of course, the process disbanded in 1974. We all know that. Pay no attention to the Satanic Temple. The head of the Satanic Temple runs a website called theprocess.org, has a process church tattoo, and one of his Satanic Temple priests has made numerous public statements claiming to be the connecting principle from the original process and the neo process. The neo process, you may be thinking, well, that's not a term that is accepted internally within the cult. I've seen screenshots. It is. In fact, there's an interesting fella who likes to stalk folks on the interwebs from that cult. Young women on the interwebs, for that matter. And in those exchanges there with Dana at Rotting Jewels, that individual has nearly been kicked out of Process Church Facebook groups, and in his demands, that creepy fellow Fred, in his demands to know, of getting kicked out of that Facebook group, he asked the head of that Facebook group, this Process Church Facebook group, he says, "Who are you, Neo? Are you the old process or the Neo process?" So, even Fred's worth something sometimes. You know what I mean? So you look at these neo process elements, right? And you look at these connections Kissinger had with like folks like Cocaine Bob, and then you see his underling Brent Scowcroft, and again, the other national security advisors again. So that attorney, that Zizian attorney, again, he's John Waters. His wife is actually him and his wife have done numerous musical albums, electronic dance music, industrial rock style albums with Boyd Rice, who's a major figure in not only the neo process. I believe he's still very high up in the Church of Satan. So that's their bandmate. This is again the Zizian's attorney, and again he's got another attorney that's the Best Friends Animal Society. The process down there in Kanab, Utah. Their pit bull lobby attorney, who's this character from Los Angeles. There is a major figure in basically all of the animal rescue places, and I highly recommend folks check out a show I did a few weeks back on some more of these topics that connect all the way back to Ohio, and a quote unquote serial killer of dogs, a local humane officer who was on the run and financed by those kind folks down in Kanab, Utah, as part of their pit bull lobby. He was one of their main pit bull trainers. In fact, his father was a dog trainer to the stars. His father, on his father's own website, has a lot of Hollywood process folks on there as his customers, but I'm getting too far off topic. So that's the Zizian's attorney, so neo process stuff. But Brent Scowcroft here, so he'd be a Cocaine Bob score of a 2, right? So we got Kissinger and Bob, and this is Kissinger's underling, right? So his assistant for many years, again, Air Force General, National Security Advisor, again, deputy and full blown. His assistant for many years was a fellow by the name of J.J. Bryan. Very spooky fellow, obviously, a lot of spook stuff here. after he departed employ with Brent Scowcroft in the mid-aughts, he did some spooky stuff, and then he came back to America and opened up something called the Victorian Art Gallery in the village of Manhattan, right around the old Process stomping grounds. And he would go on to open up other art galleries of this nature. And in that art gallery, it's pretty overtly processed. I mean, this guy's he was a character. I believe he's allegedly passed, and I do stress allegedly, especially when you see folks like the Dark Sith Overlord, Jack Lasota, head of the Zizian death cult gang there, or cult. He's faked his death numerous times and had prominent process-related attorneys who've run for mayor in Los Angeles seemingly assist him in that. And what I mean by assist him in that is old Sith Lord himself was under felony charges for some weird gun stuff and violating a bunch of children. Or I take that back, scaring the shit out of a bunch of children in a park out just north of San Francisco and violating their space of some party. They came running in there with guns. I didn't mean sexual violations. You got to clarify with this crowd. The crowd I'm discussing, that is. But yeah, so he's under those charges, and then he apparently falls off a boat in the San Francisco Bay, and his attorney, again, that same process-related fellow from Los Angeles, he comes back and is like, he goes into court and says, well, it looks like, according to this this online obituary, my client's, passed. I don't know what court you're going to get away with not proving the death of somebody. Obviously they didn't find a body allegedly, so there was no death certificate, but, strange credulity, to believe that. I mean, I think it's indicative of what we're discussing here, right? With this, the power of this process church cult network, right? Is Bob Evans skirts murder charges, cocaine trafficking charges. John Phillips, mamas and papas, he gets busted shortly after Bob. He's documented by INS reports as financing the process. So these folks, he also skirted charges. So that's what it seems like. That's what I'm getting at. It seems like a lot of power to skirt these kind of charges, and then again, a lot of power to just walk into a courtroom and say, well, this online obituary says my client's dead, so I guess this case is through. So these folks thought that the Sith Lord was dead for a while until he popped up following with different murders, and he was arrested for that murder in Pennsylvania. Right? We believe he was arrested in Maryland, but it was in Pennsylvania. So, it's it's a lot of power to be walking into a place like that. It's a lot of power to skirt charges. Again, back to these levels of national security, right? And the ability to just walk free without any questions, right? So that is what goes on here with this group. And the Vector Art Gallery, as I said, that J.J. Bryan was running, was rather overtly processed. From all their imagery, he actually had a music studio there where his band, the La Biancas, the other folks that died in the Manson families. You had the Tate Polanski murder scene. You had the La Bianca murder scene. His band, the La Biancas, number one hit single they recorded there in the studio is Charles Manson is Jesus Christ. So, fits right in line with the standard process theology. But you can see the Vector Gallery here. Victorianism was their cult. They had a little alien fella. You know what I mean? A little alien overlord fella they reported to. So, J.J. Bryan, that would be a Cocaine Bob score of 3 to the Neo process through Kissinger, Brent Scowcroft, followed by J.J. Bryan himself. So, Bob Cocaine Evans, his ties to the process, they do span decades and generations, it seems. So I do find it odd. Yeah, I did. Thank you, Desert Rain. Brian died in 2021. I knew it was somewhat recently. Oh, I did not know he had a cameo appearance on The Real Housewives of New York. Well, that's interesting. Well, that's real interesting. Kane, nice seeing the chat there, sir. Good to see you. Kane B's The Purge. Highly recommend folks check that out for any of your interest in the Idaho 4 murder case against Brian Kohberger and that tomfoolery. And what I like to call, as I like to join Kane over there quite a bit to discuss these matters of the Idaho case, what I like to call the Idaho Contra. And in fact, you might be thinking, this is way off topic here, JJ. What the hell are we talking about, Idaho? Well, in fact, before I started the show tonight, I got a message from one of Kane's team over there. I like to call Kane's Angels. He's got a team of ladies that do great work over there. Nick over the Occult Rejects, and I like to joke around. He's got himself a Charlie's Angels situation going on over there. So Kane's Angels, Heather Fitzgerald sent me a message saying something about Detective Mowry being connected to 6 degrees to Bob Cocaine Evans, and I said, my initial response was, Lord of mercy, I hope Detective Mowry of the Idaho case of Moscow PD does not have a connection to Cocaine Bob and 6 degrees or less. But yep, I quickly almost as soon as I wrote that, and hit send on there in the reply, I was like, that's wrong. So in fact, Detective Mowry, as I like to call him, he's got a Bob Cocaine or Cocaine Bob score of a 5, right? Which again, it sounds very strange. Why would this obscure detective at a Moscow, Idaho small town PD be associated at all with Bob Cocaine Evans? Well, I guess again, that is the network of Cocaine Bob, right? And this is it's a groundbreaking report that Detective Mowry produced in that Idaho case. It's the Detective Mowry crime scene report. It's very in depth. It's groundbreaking. It's a bombshell. It's going to solve a lot of problems for a lot of folks. But so in that case, in fact, one of the ISP, the Idaho State Police investigators in the case, a very integral person in the case, Detective Victoria Gooch, aka, as I like to call her, the Gooch. So no one really knew her name, really, as far as relative to the case or her importance in the case, for over 2 years following the actions in which she did. So she played a very, very integral role in December of 2022, immediately preceding her retiring. So during the first 6 weeks of that investigation, she's the one who's making the very integral interviews with the surviving roommate, Dylan Mortensen, in her frozen shock face. It's all been proved to be lies, shenanigans, and tomfoolery, yet somehow Brian Koberger's rights are still being violated and he's in jail. That's Idaho Contra for you. So she would also be the one that would investigate this infamous IgG investigation, this DNA family tree investigation of more lies, tomfoolery, and nonsense. Their own story. They're just lost in their own details at this point. The state of Idaho is in this prosecution, especially relative to matters such as the IgG and its investigation and how they achieve these things. And they literally publish there's no reports. They'll be like, we have a PowerPoint. It's a fabulous PowerPoint. And then the defense says, well, where's your reports, your justifications? How did you achieve these conclusions? We have to verify these things ourselves. And they said, no. You didn't hear me right. We have a very fabulous PowerPoint. Have you read the Mowry report? That's the state's response. So the Gooch, Detective Gooch, obviously with those 2 points, the statements for the surviving roommate that have proven to be false, but were integral in the arrest of Koberger. And then again, this tomfoolery magic show of the DNA nonsense. She's on paper and in testimony from the state lab director as being the integral member in all of that. So Victoria Gooch, by her own admissions, she's the daughter of a U.S. Army intelligence officer who was the protege of Colonel Paul Tate. Colonel Paul Tate, U.S. Army intelligence, father of murder victim and actress Sharon Tate, the wife of Roman Polanski, Bob Cocaine Evans' friends. In fact, it was old Cocaine Bob that would broker the marriage between Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate. So you have a very strange situation because Gooch's father, the Gooch, her father would travel numerous assignments from Greece to Chicago to California with Paul Tate by her own admissions. This is at the same time they're getting into California when Paul Tate's daughter's getting murdered. At the same time, Paul Tate goes undercover and infiltrates the hippie movement as a hippie to investigate his daughter's murder. And by the Gooch's own admissions in a podcast interview she did, this is a seminal moment in her life, the Sharon Tate murders. This defined many aspects of her life, as she describes in this interview. Most certainly that she didn't see her father for the next couple of years, because it seems like her father was supporting that same mission as his boss, going undercover into the infiltrating the hippie movement. So after that, they moved to Idaho. The Gooches. That's her married name. It's a Greek. I can't pronounce her. It's a Greek name, is her maiden name, but her father, obviously with that Greek name, becomes a county commissioner, I believe it is, or administrator there in Ada County. Boise, Idaho, not where the murders took place, but where the trial's taking place today. So through those connections, Mallory to Gooch, to her father, to Paul Tate, to Sharon Tate, his daughter, to the man that brokered that marriage between her and Polanski, Mr. Cocaine Bob, Detective Meowry. I'm not sure. This might actually be in the summary of the report. Detective Meowry has a Cocaine Bob score of 5. Again, I'm not an expert in this, but report he may have actually included that in his summary here in the because they didn't include any evidence of anything about any incriminating evidence against Brian Koberger in the reports. I have to presume at least there is some information in there worthwhile. Maybe Detective Meowry listed that in the back in the summary of the footnotes that he's a Cocaine Bob score of 5. So on that note, again, y'all thought Idaho that was totally separated from Cocaine Bob, and turns out it's not the case. Not the case at all. And on that note, I just want to take a brief intermission with.
Hell, every guy's got his dream, am I right? Between you, me, and a wall, I had a doozy myself last night. Get this. A corn-fed harvest mouse, a hooker, a nun, a Flemish peasant woman, whips, chains, whistles, yo-yos, a circus midget, my grandmother riding by on a bicycle, give me the finger, and a duck. Now, I don't know. Are you crying?
Brief intermission, folks of the interwebs. Thanks for standing by. Next character on the list here tonight, we got. We'll go back to Roman Polanski, where we just left off. Sharon Tate's husband, the presumed father. You never know with these sex cultists. The presumed father of Sharon Tate's unborn child. She was 8.5 months, I believe, pregnant. It's time of her murder. So her husband, Roman Polanski, again, friend of Bob's, friend of Cocaine Bob. So he had a Bob score of 1. Him and Bob were doing the Rosemary's Baby film together, right? Big project of theirs, very important it seemed. In fact, Sharon Tate allegedly was trying to get on as the Mia Farrow character, the main character in the film, but old Cocaine Bob wasn't having it. He needed Frank Sinatra's wife on the film for some reason there, right? Mia Farrow. Apparently Sinatra was hanging out there too with his wife, and I would think they were at the end of their relations, but hanging out there on the set as well, along with his pal Sammy Davis. In fact, it seems a lot of these rat packers may in fact had a lot to do with Satanism, not the least of which Sinatra. But the next character on the list, like I said, Roman Polanski, and he's a pretty infamous character today. He's got a lot of support in Hollywood, despite being fleeing the country under charges of the rape of a 13-year-old. After being indicted for the rape of a 13-year-old and posting bond, he said, "I'm out." France won't extradite him. Why Ghislaine Maxwell didn't get that memo, since she's a French citizen, courtesy of her mother. France hasn't extradited. I'm not sure they extradited anybody. They certainly haven't extradited a French citizen since 1792. So, basically, he's not going anywhere. Now Johnny Depp's done films with him since. I mean, again, Hollywood's got a lot of support for this guy, but it was old Cocaine Bob that came over to Jack Nicholson's house. Their other buddy, Roman and Bob's other buddy Jack, came over to Cocaine Bob came to the rescue, clean up the scene, quiet everything down after the rape there. So, and again, we'll get back to Johnny Depp here in a moment, because I previously already mentioned the film Blow and the Medellin cartel. But yeah, him and Polanski have had their own associations in recent years. I can't think of the film they did together, but we'll just look it up here real fast. The sex abuse. Yep, we just talked about that. Filmography. There we go. Let's see here. There we go. The Ninth Gate. I should have known that. I was going to call it something else, but certainly not that. Yeah, The Ninth Gate. So that was 1999. Polanski and Depp, neo-noir horror thriller film. It's a piece of shit, if you ask me. But obviously, what it seems to indicate is you know, a lot of folks don't have any problems with Polanski, even though he's raped a 13-year-old, and Johnny Depp's one of them. You know, and Johnny Depp, again, interesting character in all of these narratives concerning, you know, Bob Cocaine Evans and neo process figures and whatnot. So Rosemary's Baby, you know, Polanski, and this is again 1968. This is right when Bob took over. This is a big project for them. I don't think Polanski had an American film prior to this. I think this was his American film debut, if I remember correctly. And then on the set of that film, according to the man's obituary in Variety magazine, the periodical there in Hollywood, which I'm pulling up right now because I don't have it readily available, Anton Zander LaVey dies in 1997. This is Variety, the Hollywood publication. I show this is because this is the source I got this from, but according to this, he was the technical advisor on Rosemary's Baby. Again, this is the official, you know, he's dead. This is his obituary for Hollywood, Anton Zander LaVey. He's also listed in the same year, 1997, as the technical advisor for a film called Devil's Reign in 1974, starring William Shatner. He didn't make the cut today for the list of Bob's friends, but he's on there. So we'll get to him in maybe a future installment of, you know, helping Kevin Bacon find a new Patsy and 6 Degrees of Cocaine Bob Evans. But tonight here, Anton Zander LaVey here was, you know, Sammy Davis's buddy there we saw with Aquino. He was a technical advisor apparently on Rosemary's Baby. He was also like I said, the technical advisor on Devil's Reign. In Devil's Reign, he met a brand new, recently converted Scientologist by the name of John Travolta, a young actor on the film. This is the film. There was another Scientologist, as the legend goes. There was another Scientologist on the film, and that lady recruited old Johnny boy here, you know, very young Travolta here, you know, to join Scientology. And on that film, Devil's Reign, technical advisor there, you know, hugging it out. Well, at least LaVey's hugging it out. Anton LaVey and John Travolta. So, you know, you got Roman Polanski, right? Anton LaVey, the technical advisor. So you got Polanski's got a score of 1. LaVey's got a score of 2. Travolta's got a Bob Cocaine score of 3, and sadly, tragically, and I want to note here Travolta's body language, because he seems to not want to hug up on LaVey. But what I can tell you is, from my experience, old Johnny boy, he gets real handsy, especially if you run into him on a secluded airfield at midnight on a Friday night and invite him to a hangar full of young Air Force MPs. You know, in hindsight, I think old Johnny boy thought, jackpot. But apparently, I have a score, a Cocaine Bob score myself of 5, because I didn't really nearly shoot John Travolta. I did threaten him with a gun. He was getting real handsy with some of my aircraft at an air show in Dayton, Ohio, circa 2003. So we were really there guarding that thing, the stealth fighter in a hangar. My team and I were, and I was doing a patrol late one night. We were night shift doing a patrol. We had a bunch of other aircraft there, and see someone across the airfield. It's about midnight, you know, and there's nobody out there. It's all supposed to be empty, and someone across the airfield, a man and a woman and a child, and the man's, you know, like I said, he's getting real handsy with the aircraft. So I zip over there in my golf cart that I was patrolling the airfield on there, and jump out of there with my rifle and just start, you know, yelling, "Get your damn hands off my aircraft!" And man turns around and realizes, oh shit, that's John Travolta. And he said, "Are you John Travolta?" And he's obviously, yeah, I'm John Travolta. I'm like, well, what's going on here? He's like, that's my plane. I just flew here. I'm trying to process these things, right? You know, I'm no pun intended, but I turn around is where he's pointing, and he's, you know, his big 737 Qantas airliners aircraft was there that he owned, and apparently he was the MC of that air show. But you know, no one sent me the memo. You know what I mean? Like, no one sent the night shift, security dude for the Air Force aircraft the memo, apparently, right? So, because we'd already been there a night or two before that, and the air show was that whole weekend. But I felt bad. Apparently, the woman he was with was his publicist, because again, it was he was the master of ceremonies. and her child. And again, it was late at night, and I felt bad. I invited him to come see the Stealth Fighter, and you know, and I was like, oh, wait a second, he's probably already seen that. He did that movie Broken Arrow, but publicist and child, they were tired, they left, and old Johnny Boy, he had himself a jackpot with 6 strapping young military policemen in a secluded airplane hangar on a Friday night, right? So he was a very nice guy, a little bit handsy. Like I said in this photo, he pulls me in at the last moment, and and I was like, oh, we're doing that, okay? So I kind of just pulled away, and then I put my arm around him because then I felt bad in the process there again, no pun intended. But got real handsy. I wasn't comfortable when I saw those tabloids published years later. I was like, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. So apparently, my Cocaine Bob score is 4, courtesy of Mr. Travolta there. The next person up on our list here tonight, folks, and again, in our effort of humanity to aid and abet actor Kevin Bacon in his troubles of locating a new patsy for the 6 Degrees game, because it's obviously troubled him. He was very upset, as we saw in that video clip, very upset. So the next character on the list, Charles Bluedhorn. He was the head of Gulf and Western Industries, this multinational conglomerate, who would buy Paramount Pictures and immediately hire Bob Cocaine Evans, a man who I don't think he really had any hire, and a former women's salesman, hires Bob Cocaine Evans to run the studio. So he's, I think maybe Bob had like 1 or 2 producing credits at the time, but certainly not running a whole studio, right? So seemingly unorthodox. Old Bluedhorn here, an Austrian fella, just happened to show up in America shortly after the war. As a teenager, the Army, Air Corps, and Air Force, and then would suddenly, acquire a great amount of wealth in industry by starting off, like, I think it was a tire business in Michigan. So 10 years later, he's owning Paramount and, half the island of the Dominican Republic, most of the sugar production anywhere that comes into America, and real estate, dealings with the Vatican. So interesting man, this Charles Bluedhorn. He would die. He would have an early demise, meet an early demise as well, seemingly of a heart attack on one of his trips back from the Dominican Republic. Like I said, he owned a good portion of the island, and he died in 1983, I believe it was, coming back from there. Yeah, February 19th, 1983. Bluedhorn died, age 56, of a heart attack on his corporate jet while returning home to New York City. So he, on a slightly separate non-Bob Cocaine, well, not that far off from Bob Cocaine, but it's these characters around this JFK situation that were dying around those late 70s, early 80s, all in these kind of, jet, private corporate jet accidents and whatnot, or heart attacks on the jet, I got a lot of questions about those kind of things. But Charles Bluedhorn here, like I said, big owner of the Dominican Republic. Bluedhorn was a friend of former president of the according to this, autobiography stuff. So, that makes sense. He's a big industrialist dude, sugar stuff, owns, a lot of the Dominican Republic next door, right? So that kind of jives. That kind of jives. You would know Fidel Castro. I could definitely see that. So Fidel Castro, him and Fidel Castro, Bluedhorn, Cocaine Bob, score of 1. Fidel Castro was actually an actor. I'm not sure if many folks of the interwebs realize that. Fidel Castro actually has an IMDb page. He was a SAG, I'm not sure if he was a SAG carrying actor, but he worked in Hollywood. He's got his IMDb page here. Old Fidel here. So Hollywood, Easy to Wed in 1946. This is where we get into kind of actually playing the actual Kevin Bacon game. I figured to appease Kevin Bacon, we'd at least throw in a little bit of acting in there too. Some acting credits. And again, Cocaine Bob being such a legendary Hollywood producer, got to include some films. So in the film Easy to Wed, 1946, you have Fidel Castro in a small part, but it stars Lucille Ball. I Love Lucy, right? Now, I don't know if folks really realize what a large figure she was in Hollywood. So she and her husband Desi Arnaz, the Cuban fella, and I don't know where he was with Castro, but I'm sure they knew each other, or at least knew of each other, right? So Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz started Desilu production company, which they had a big sound stage and studio and everything, and on a lot, and they had the real estate. They had they did films like Star Trek, starring Bill Shatner from that Devil's Rain film, and other TV shows like Mission Impossible, right? And of course the Lucy shows, right? So in 1968, right after Charles Bluhdorn would purchase Paramount Studios, right after Charles Bluhdorn would purchase or hire Bob Cocaine Evans, he would buy out Desilu Productions and from Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz. So that makes Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz here. You got Charles Bluhdorn, his score of 1, Fidel Castro, a Cocaine Bob score of 2. You got Fidel Castro acting with Lucille Ball here in this film Easy to Wed in 46. That gives Lucille Ball a Cocaine Bob score of 3. And then again, Lucille Ball sells her company to Charles Bluhdorn in 68. So that just went full circle. We went full circle there. We're back to we're stuck in a Bob Cocaine Evans fueled nightmare here, I guess. In a loop, a time warp. Bob Cocaine Evans, cocaine infused time warp, because we went from Charles Bluhdorn back to Charles Bluhdorn. But that's the life of Cocaine Bob Evans, I suppose. And I guess I should have mentioned this probably at the beginning of tonight's program. However, if folks don't realize why I say Bob Cocaine Evans, other than the fact that gave him that nickname, is I would prefer not to get it confused with Bob Evans, the Sausage King of Ohio. Many of you folks have probably enjoyed some of the delicious breakfast meats and other things here at the many locations of Bob Evans, but it originates here out of Ohio. We like to call him Bob, the Sausage King of Ohio Evans, not to be confused with Bob Cocaine Evans. Just want to clarify that for folks, in case there was clear up any misconceptions or any confusion there. Now, the next character, the last character we'll be covering here this evening is let me see here. Back to that murder of Roy Radin. Actually, no, wait, I got 2 more characters. Disregard last. Apologize. Trying to cut this short, and I got 2 more characters. The next character on the list. How could I forget this character? What was I thinking? So the next character, I guess I got lost in that Bob Cocaine Evans and fueled cocaine fueled time warp there, because I got lost here forgetting all about Barry Diller. So when Bob leaves Paramount under numerous conditions. So he leaves. So Charles Bluhdorn, Bob leaves Paramount following his position as president and production of Paramount, I believe 74, and Charles Bluhdorn hires Bob's protege, Barry Diller. He would later be known as the creator of a lot of television in America, and his proteges would be known as Diller's Killers. All these folks that would go on to produce these executives throughout TV and stuff. That started with Barry Diller, who was Bob Cocaine Evans' protege. So Bob wants to be on the big screen. He wants his name on the big screen. So he leaves to be a full-time. He strikes himself as a deal for a while as being the head of Paramount still, but as an executive producer through those early 70s. But by the mid 70s, he wanted just to be a producer. So he produces that Hoffman film, Dustin Hoffman, Marathon Man, I believe, was his first big effort after this split. But the split would be Bob gets to stay on the Paramount lot with his productions. Gets an office and everything else like that, and his protege Barry Diller takes over. So that's Barry Diller. Bob, he's got a Cocaine Bob score of 1. And if you never heard of the name Barry Diller before, he's a very, very powerful man. Not only did he, like I said, his proteges and underlings go start all this TV stuff. Again, like he's credited right here. He is chairman and senior executive of IAC and Expedia Group. I'll get into both of those in a minute. And founded Fox Broadcasting Company with Rupert Murdoch and USA Broadcasting, right? Now, USA Broadcasting, as I mentioned earlier, folks, that Al Ruddy guy, Cocaine Bob's co-producer there with Joe Colombo on The Godfather, the first one. Al Ruddy, the Rand Corps CIA guy, he would go on to produce be the executive producer of a lot of USA Network hits, such as Walker, Texas Ranger with Chuck Norris. So, like I said, his old Al Ruddy's relations with Al Ruddy's relations with Cocaine Bob and gang would obviously last a couple decades if he's doing that in the 70s, right, with Cocaine Bob, and then in the 90s with Bob's underling here, Barry Diller. Nonetheless, Diller's an interesting character. Expedia Group, IAC. So IAC is the international, what do they call this? International something. I always forget the name of this company. International, well, we'll just call it IAC. So they own the USA Corporation. I mean, he owns a lot of stuff under this, right? Including Expedia and stuff like that. I think he sold some of those assets, but what he's really known for, what I recognize him for, is in that IAC Corporation, is they own, like, so if you book a hotel, this is my understanding from my research and understanding of talking to folks even at hotels, if you book through any of these other websites, they still book through Expedia. Expedia, that company that he owns and the underlying software, they own all of this apparently proprietary software that books hotels. So like you can book it through apparently Priceline, but Priceline then apparently books it through Expedia or some dumb shit. So that's Barry Diller. He also, on that same note, apparently owns the underlying software and code for dating apps. Well, they own at IAC a variety of dating apps listed on their Wikipedia. Apparently every other dating app still uses their underlying software. And one thing relative to that, relative to some quote unquote neo-process type activities, the smiley face killings, I highly suspect some of those victims, and there is good evidence to support same, I highly suspect some of those victims have been stalked through dating apps. So I can think of two specifically, Joey LaBute, March of 2017 in Columbus, Ohio, and Dakota James, I believe the following year in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So the both of those individuals were last seen, two mid-20s gay white males last seen using dating apps. So there are heterosexual victims as well that have been seen using dating apps, but those two were likely using, I think one was confirmed to be using Grindr. The other one was just mentioned as a dating app, I believe, by the law enforcement. So is anyone looking into these things? Is there more to be said with these dating apps and the stalking of these young men and these victims of these quote unquote accidental drownings? Yeah, they're murders, and I suspect that many of them are being stalked through things such as the dating apps owned and operated by IAC Corporation, or at least their underlying code are, and that is again Cocaine Bob's former protege Barry Diller. Now, Barry Diller is also known because I don't know if he got on board with funding the Hulk Hogan lawsuit against Gawker, with Peter Thiel, but Peter Thiel famously funded it, was, I believe, bragged about it, funding that lawsuit to shut down the online periodical tabloid thing Gawker for outing him as a homosexual conservative, right? You couldn't, at the time, you couldn't be a homosexual as a conservative, and you couldn't be a conservative in Silicon Valley. So Peter Thiel was up shit's creek, and he financed Hulk Hogan's sex tape lawsuit to shut down Gawker. However, you have characters like Barry Diller here, who around the same time, Gawker's publishing Barry Diller's Sexy All Boy Thanksgiving, where he apparently had a bunch of young men, apparently at least of the photos of legal age on an island for Thanksgiving, looking real weird. On paper, he's married to some lady named Diane von Furstenberg, who's apparently the ex-wife of some Prince von Furstenberg. So a lot of tomfoolery and douchebaggery, most likely, but nonetheless, Barry Diller's All Sexy All Boy Thanksgiving. Apparently, Gawker may have gotten himself in trouble for publishing that. So back to IAC. So Barry Diller's got a Bob Cocaine score of 1. Longtime board member of IAC there with Barry Diller, and Barry Diller's a big-time donator to the Clinton Foundation, the large-scale criminal fraud known as the Clinton Foundation and the Clinton Global Initiative, started in part by Jeffrey Epstein, according to a document filed by his attorney Alan Dershowitz in a court in Florida back in 2007. The Clinton Epstein founded the Clinton Global Initiative. So Chelsea Clinton here. Again, Diller donates to both. Chelsea Clinton here sits on Diller's board for IAC. Has for many years. What experience she has, couldn't tell you. On paper, educationally speaking, it seems like her expertise has been studying diarrhea in Africa. And I wish I was making that up. I believe her senior thesis was on a diphtheria outbreak somewhere in Africa. So she was studying diarrhea turds in Africa. So apparently that qualifies her to work for Barry Diller's corporate board here. I suspect it has more to do with her name, but you see what I'm saying. So she's got a Bob cocaine score, cocaine Bob score 2, right? Like I said, Barry Diller's got himself some, Clinton donation things again. Clinton Global Initiative, according to Epstein and Dershowitz. That's Epstein. Epstein did that. And then you look at this situation here. You got Ghislaine Maxwell, right? So she famously attends Chelsea Clinton's 2010 wedding, right? And it wasn't she wasn't on the guest list for that wedding, She Ghislaine Maxwell, that is. Apparently the guest list included this fella here on the right, Ted Wyatt, or Ted Waitt, W-A-I-T-T. He's a co-founder of Gateway Computers. Gateway to what? I'm not sure. Because if you talk to Ghislaine Maxwell's brother-in-law, who just happens to be the son of infamous Thelamite sex magic ritual solid-state rocket fuel inventor Jack Parsons. Jack Parsons, number 2 there in his quote-unquote suicide squad of ritual magic to create that rocket fuel was a fellow by the name of Molina. Molina's son is married to Ghislaine Maxwell's sister. He's a computer science fellow who likes to talk to aliens or demons, depending on which day of the week you ask him. It seems he uses those terms interchangeably. So when Ghislaine's boyfriend here, Ted Waitt, is the co-founder of Gateway Computers, I have to ask, a gateway to what? So he was the one invited by the Clintons, and she was the plus one, as the story goes. Now that's 2010. So years prior to that, he's married to his wife and him divorced, I think around 2008, maybe. I think it was 2008. So a number of years prior to that, though. So he's dating Ghislaine Maxwell, this known recruiter for this Epstein sex trafficking network and whatnot. So when I see Ted Wyatt years prior to that, despite him being married, when I see a young lady who was sex trafficked as a teenager, I don't know for a fact by Epstein or the Maxwell network, but when I see a young lady who was sex trafficked as a young teenager posing in photographs with Ted Waitt at his wife's 40th birthday party in San Diego, I got a lot of questions when I see Ted Waitt later dating Ghislaine Maxwell. But this that is the case. That is the case here. So you got Barry Diller, Bob cocaine score 1, Chelsea Clinton 2. Then you go on to her guest, again, not Ghislaine Maxwell, her guest, Ted Waitt. And then you go on to with that Ted Waitt being number 3, and then this young lady who was victim to sex trafficking and murdered in Henderson, Nevada, in April of 2001, and this is her posing with Ted Waitt at Ted Wait's wife's 40th birthday party at the Waitt House in San Diego. I believe this photograph was 11 months prior to her murder, so it's still unsolved murder. So when I see, and so this young sex trafficking victim, sadly enough, has a cocaine Bob score of 4. But she, I have a lot of questions when you see a fellow like this Gateway Computer fella dating Ghislaine Maxwell, going to Clinton stuff, donating money places like that. And again, dating Maxwell at a time where she's apparently being a recruiter for Epstein. That's the height of Epstein activity when they're dating. They start dating, I believe it's 2009, 2010, right before that wedding. So, and then again, years prior, what's Ted Waitt doing years prior? Why has he got sex trafficking victims? Young women that got sex. This woman got sex trafficked out of Charleston, South Carolina. She's in San Diego a few months later, posing at a photograph with Ted Waitt at his wife's 40th birthday party, and then she's dead. She's murdered 11 months later in an unsolved murder in Henderson, Nevada. So I got a lot of questions around these folks, but those folks being Cocaine Bob's associations and network right here. 6 Degrees of Bob Cocaine Evans. So, last character of the evening, folks of the interwebs. And if you want to get some more of the details about Bob Cocaine Evans and his friends and what the current treatment of Hollywood is, and I'll probably do a Bob Cocaine Evans score on this whole podcast here in the future, but and the characters involved in it. But this is apparently a new Hollywood, a current Hollywood production of a podcast on the subject of the Cotton Club murders, the murder of Roy Radin, again involving Cocaine Bob, the Medellin cartel's dude's wife, Laney Jacobs, aka Karen Greenberger, and the hired hitmen they used, including Bill Menser, who's in prison today for that murder of Roy Radin, who was a security guard for Larry Flint, who plays into these matters in other capacities of this process church cult network, if you will. But nonetheless, you got Juliette Lewis. I believe she's a confirmed Scientologist. Christian Slater, I thought he was dead, literally. I didn't know he was still alive. And Rainn Wilson from The Office. That's an odd combo. I will do a Manson score. I will do a Cocaine Bob score, as Christian Slater is apparently playing the part of Bob Evans here in this series that I've yet to listen to. But it is apparently a podcast series based upon the Cotton Club murders. So, not sure if it's any good, but I'm sure it's something can be gleaned. So that is the last character of the evening here, is this Cotton Club murders and the murder of Roy Radin, who was a kind of a off-Broadway, kind of a theatrical producer from New York City who lived on Long Island. He got some charges for the rape of Melanie Holler from John Travolta's cast members there on Welcome Back, Kotter. And this apparently a very violent rape situation in his home out in the Hamptons. I believe he skirting charges on the drugs and the rape, but they got him for a gun charge. Well, we'll get you for a gun charge, Roy. He would be killed, not that long after there, again out in Los Angeles, murdered there with Cocaine Bob and gang. But it is Roy Radin that has connections to the Son of Sam stuff and the Process Church stuff in New York City, and it seemed to be the thesis of author Maury Terry that this was he played an integral role within the cult network in New York City. Similarly, in a similar nature, Bob Cocaine Evans played a similar role in the Los Angeles-based Process Church network activities. So it was almost like feuding capos. Feuding capos like the Colombo crime family capo Michael Franchise, David Berkowitz's friend, and the old Gambino capo, crime family capo. I always call him Sammy the Songbird Gravano, Sammy the Bull Gravano, but I call him Sammy the Songbird because he sang like a songbird when they, when push came to shove, he started ratting everybody out. But kind of a capo feud like that where they both scream at each other about being rats for a while on the interwebs, but instead Bob and Roy they murdered each other. Someone got murdered. I'm not saying those other fellas didn't murder folks. I'm just saying, it's kind of a similar feel to me. You got these feuding capos, from different sides of the country, and then those guys are in New York together, the Gambinos and Colombos, but they'll scream at each other all day about being rats. It's weird. So Karen Greenberger, like I said, she was married to Larry Greenberger, very wealthy family, Lake Okeechobee regions of Florida. And they just, like I said, he was murdered after being divulged as being the Medellin guy in America, the top dude. And then she's now being investigated for that murder. 35-year-old Okeechobee cold case gets fresh out of eyes. March 20th, 2024. So this is on the night of September 13th, 1988, Larry Greenberger. So when his wife got busted there for the Radin murder, she thought they were going to question her about this. She didn't know they were questioning her about a murder from 5 years prior. So who knows what she did in between. On the night of September 13th, 1988, Larry Greenberger sat down on his rocking chair on his front porch to oil his gun, a .44 Magnum. Classic tale of he was just cleaning his gun, folks. There's rounds just happen to pop in the back of the head. So, he gets shot. No one really cared about it. Now they're looking at it. But, his wife at the time there, at the murder, apparent culprit in the matter is, this is her photograph from the LA County proceedings there in the Cotton Club murders of Roy Radin. Again, the same case that when Bob Cocaine Evans got called to the stand by LA County prosecutors in the first hearing in the grand jury hearing, he was a suspect. And they called him to the stand under oath, and he pled the fifth. And the judge yelled at him a bunch, and then nothing ever came of it. So, because the state was like, we still might charge this guy, So he walked away on that one. But that's her she got life. She's sitting out there now, supposedly. Again, good luck finding any more recent photos or a mugshot. I've been unsuccessful in doing either. She is listed as a occupant of the California penal system. I have a lot of questions about that California penal system, and I don't want to get too far off topic, but when we're talking about the California penal system, that is the prison system of California, and we're talking about the subjects of this nature, we have to talk about Charles Manson, of course, in his time as being a lifelong occupant of that, at least of his adult life, of that same penal system. And I wonder, every time you see Charles Manson do interviews, from prison, right? He's doing, you got the weird dancing interviews. He's always giving interviews from prison when he was in there, right? His hair and beard never meet the guidelines and restrictions. They do not comport with the guidelines and restrictions of the California Penal System Code for length of hair and length of beard. His co-constituents and co-conspirators, allegedly in the Manson murders, the ones that are in jail for that for life, Bobby Beausoleil, Tex Watson, the men in those crimes, not the women, the men, their hair always complies with the California Penal Code regulations for length of hair and beard. So, was Chuck ever in prison? I'm just throwing it out there. You know what I mean? Doesn't make a lot of sense to me. As you see here, his shit was never within regs. And you look how tight this dude's mustache is in the background. They're using a ruler to get it that tight. I've been there. I've seen that stuff in the military. I didn't have facial hair in the military. I didn't start growing a beard until afterwards. So that, to that point, it wasn't. I'm just saying. I saw friends. You gotta get jammed up pretty quick if your stuff's not within the regulations. If you got your mustache going too much, you try to be a white dude wearing a beard and trying to claim you got like a beard waiver, because while black fellas serving in the military, they get have to shave all the time, getting all the razor burns and stuff. They get what they call waivers for not having to shave, right? So, I saw a lot of folks just trying to be lazy and be like, oh, I got a shaving waiver, that kind of thing. But because folks are real anal about that. And they're sure they're real anal about that in the penal system there in California, where Charles Manson didn't seem to have to comply with those regulations. But his pals, Tex Watson and Bobby Beausoleil, most certainly do. Most certainly. You can look up mugshots. You can find mugshots of Charles Manson not complying with the regulations of hair length and beard length. You just can't find any mugshots of Laney Jacobs, aka Karen Greenberger, her legal name. So here's Tex Watson, full compliance, beard, facial hair, length of hair, everything. So I don't know, something to consider. Is Karen Greenberger in prison? I've never seen her there. I couldn't tell you. All I can say is if you look at a current trend with the same group of folks, these folks in around the activities of old Bob Cocaine Evans here, be it Charles Manson, again, associated with the Polanskis, etc. Or Greenberger here is co-conspirator in the murder of Roy Radin. It's kind of odd that you can't find any mugshots of this lady. She's supposed to be in prison. You really can't find any of Menser. The last one, so Menser, the hitman in this crime, I think the last mugshot on file for him I could find in the state was like 2000. So he's allegedly in prison there too still. So I don't know. But when you're the wife of the number one Medellin cartel dude in America and you skirted on those murder charges for long enough, and then they just happen to get you on this one, I don't know that someone didn't stamp shit national security and they ducked her off somewhere else. She was already doing operations in Los Angeles under an assumed name. I presume that was her agency name, Laney Jacobs. Her legal name was Karen Greenberger. You can look for her. What information you can find on her today on the interwebs, she's often described as Laney Jacobs relative to these murders, even though, again, the official legal documents will mention Karen Greenberger. That is her legal name. I'm just saying I strongly suspect the elephant in the room that's never been properly described, and to put that all into context with her is Laney Jacobs was her agency name that she was working Iran-Contra drug trafficking operations in and around Los Angeles under in 1983. And in 1988, when she got busted, she was already apparently on the cleanup crew because her husband, again, just got outed and he got murked. And then she walked on that and still walking on that, apparently. So something to consider when you can't find folks in prison is do these folks disappear under some stamp of national security. That same stamp that old Cocaine Bob's buddy Henry Kissinger and gang would be readily available to provide such a stamp. Who were all still alive at the time of this state trial for the murder of Roy Radin in the state of California, but some federal national security stamping might have went on after that, because where the hell is this lady, and why was Charles Manson never in compliance? I think Tex Watson, I can believe, they always have, I feel like a lot of these operations have to have a fall guy. The Idaho situation right now, Iran-Contra had a number of fall guys, but they had a number of folks that just literally walked as well, right? But the Idaho situation, Koberger's obviously a fall guy. I mean, he's the Pats, he's a fall guy, but some fall guys, when you're in a situation as high up as this lady, Koberger's not a high up kind of fall guy. He's a convenience kind of fall guy, right? When you get jammed up 5 years after some stuff, and you're cleaning up stuff out already with the murder of her husband, it just seems like this lady seems like a character you may want to, she got a lot of information on her still, so who knows where she is, but allegedly she's in a California prison. However, so the Medellin cartel is famously, in recent decades, famously told through the lens of George Young, who would have been an associate and likely Larry Greenberger likely helped probably put George Young away and take over his role in the Medellin cartel in a internal coup style operations of the American component of the Medellin cartel. And that is what is told about in the film Blow, which is the life story of George Young, starring Johnny Depp. It is told that there is a coup. His friends do act against him. And I think the fellow you see in that film, who's a Florida pilot, I think that's Larry Greenberger. They call him like Tom Nelson, I think, in the film. But I think that I would say that character is based on Larry Greenberger. So if you watch the film Blow, it seems like based upon the character details. I mean, it's probably a composite, but the aspect of the composite of the fact that this guy is usurping the power within the network here in America, and the fact that he's a pilot from Florida, these all jive with the character aspects of Larry Greenberger. But in the film, he's referred to as I don't recall. I know he's a pilot though. Well, anyhow, if you watch the film, it's not. I didn't dislike the movie. I guess it was okay, right? But if you watch the film, I presume you'll readily see the guy I'm talking about. Kind of a tall white fella dude, kind of squirrely looking. But anyway, he's one of the guys that helps put George Young in prison. Johnny Depp's character there, and again, those character attributes go along with old Larry Greenberger, number one Medellin dude in America. So Johnny Depp and George Young, the character basis there, this is before the film, and they're hanging out years after the film. They seem to be buds, right? They seem to have a lot in common, these two. In fact, George Young would get out of prison for all that cocaine trafficking, go back up with his buddies in Los Angeles. So if you've seen the film Blow, Pee Wee Herman, he's a hairdresser, much like Jay Sebring or who was a Manson family victim there. He was a hairdresser and cocaine and drug trafficker in Los Angeles. Derek For Real was the character's name in Blow. That's Pee Wee Herman's character. He's also playing that very similar regard. Apparently, Jay Sebring wasn't the only hairdresser in town dealing drugs in Los Angeles at that time. You also have George Young's buddies. So it's a composite character of two brothers who had a hair salon in Los Angeles. They're in Hollywood. Those two brothers comprise the character that is Pee Wee Herman's Derek For Real in the film Blow. But those are real folks. And George Young, when he got out of prison, went out there to have a birthday party with him. I think he actually violated probation in doing so. But pretty tight with old Johnny Depp there, Mr. Neo Process himself. And so it is, we go from Karen Greenberger, right? Cocaine Bob scored 2 with the Manson or the Roy Radin murders, Cotton Club murders business. And then her husband, Larry Greenberger, would be a score 3. His associate, George Young, Cocaine Bob score 4, right? I'm sorry, wait. 1, 2. I can't count. This would be a Cocaine Bob of 3. So Karen Greenberger, 1. Larry Greenberger, 2. George Young, 3. And then we go Johnny Depp, right? 4. He got himself on, at least on, he's got numerous Cocaine Bob pathways, but in this one he's a Cocaine Bob score 4, And then we look at the film that Johnny Depp's directorial debut. And that directorial debut was a film in 1997 named The Brave. And it stars Johnny Depp and Marlon Brando, and Johnny Depp is the director. It is produced by a fellow by the name of Charles Evans Jr., who just happens to be the nephew or the son of Charles Evans Sr., who's the co-conspirator in a drug trafficking case back in 1980 and brother of none other than Cocaine Bob Evans. So we go Karen Greenberger, Larry Greenberger, Medellin guy number 1 in America. He's at cocaine score 2. To George Young, the Johnny Depp's character in Blow, to Johnny Depp with a score of 4. To Charles Evans, the man who produced and funded and financed Johnny Depp's directorial debut here, starring Cocaine Bob's other friend, Marlon Brando. And then that's a score of 5 through that trek, even though, again, he's his nephew and technically would be a lot closer. But then I couldn't achieve a full 6 degrees back to Cocaine Bob. So Cocaine Bob is 6 degrees from himself through the cocaine of Greenberger, Young, Depp, back to Evans, who was the son of Bob Cocaine's co-conspirator in that cocaine trafficking charge, Charles Evans Sr., his brother, and former women's clothing salesman. I kind of picture an Al Bundy, married with children environment with those two in the women's shoes type of thing. Then we go 6 degrees back to Bob. So we just got stuck in another Cocaine Bob fueled time warp, I think, because we went 6 degrees right back to Bob. So Cocaine Bob Evans, maybe not so much of a part of Americana and American folklore as his pal, or at least his associate in same social circles, Charles Manson, but it's pretty damn close. And as far as his process stuff goes, from Kissinger through his buddy Scowcroft on to Bryan, from the early onset of national security stuff to the more recent era operations of national security stuff, all with process stuff dancing around it. You have to ask yourself, is that why we know so little about an organization that allegedly ended in 1974? Is it because many of these things do get stamped national security? And, I think it's worth asking, that's for sure. And when we have such seemingly obscure connections as, Detective Meowry of the Idaho 4 investigation in the case against Idaho versus Koberger, murder of 4 young college students. Detective Meowry's got a Cocaine Bob score of 5. I mean, you got to ask yourself, folks, what kind of world are we living in here? Not only do they present PowerPoints as evidence in, capital murder trials where they're trying to seek the death penalty, this stick figure and misspelled crayon report is literal. I mean, it's not literally their report, but it's, it's literally equivalent to their report. That's what the state's presenting. Like, look, we got fabulous PowerPoints. We're gonna fry this guy. He did it. So, when you see folks like stuff like that going on around, these Idaho Contra matters, if you will, with the drug trafficking, the gun trafficking, the money laundering, and you got 5 degrees and less of multiple characters there, because again, when you got a focal point of the gooch, there's a lot of folks that have some 6 degrees or less to old Cocaine Bob in the Idaho situation. But the Cocaine Bob, nonetheless, an interesting character from Hollywood, from his early days in Westchester County, New York, where his mother hails from there. And he hails from New York City there, and many roots there in Westchester County, kinfolk was, to his very anomalous, meteoric rise in Hollywood, to this legendary status in Hollywood as this legendary Hollywood producer that would be, seen satirized and, parodied throughout numerous films and projects and so on and so forth. In fact, as I'm rambling on here about all these connections of old Cocaine Bob, and not just, again, the Kissinger, but more so just the national security aspects, the fellow that's writing the propaganda for all the Idaho 4 case, a fellow by the name of Howard Bloomberg's, I don't know, one of these things. Blum's. Oh, it's Pam. That's right, Pam. No, it's Howard Blum. I just always, whenever I think of words I can't pronounce, I think of that Step Brothers bit where they're trying to figure out that lady's name Pam. They go to the interviews with the tuxedos, and she's like, "My name's Pam." They're like, "What is it, Pan or Pan? Pan?" So I was in my brain hole. That's what goes on with Blum too, because the guy's just a joke in himself. But he's writing all this propaganda piece. It started January 7th, 2023, the day after Kohberger got extradited back to Idaho from Pennsylvania. That whole article series is published in something called Airmail, which was a publication founded, I think, in 2019, which is some weird it's an obscure publication. But they hired Mr. New York Times bestselling, whatever else he is, Howard Blum, to write this, this propaganda stuff on Kohberger, where he's just lying about shit for, years, and just publishing all these articles in this series, claiming all this wild shit that is always proved to be, inaccurate, false, and completely manufactured. He's doing this as recently as last week. He wrote a book in June of last year, compiling a lot of that series, but he's continued the series on. The man who started Airmail, the co-founder of Airmail, Howard Blum's employer, is the man who was the executive producer of Bob Cocaine Evans' biopic documentary, "The Kid Stays in the Picture." So the kid stays in the picture, which is, again, that's what I said, is Bob always wanted his name in the picture. He's always wanted his name in the Hollywood lights. Always wanted to stay in the picture. That's what he would say. He's always want to stay in the pictures. So the kid stays in the picture was a 2002 autobiographical, it was 1994 book, but the film adaptation was the autobiopic pick here in 2002. And it's about the life story of old Cocaine Bob. And, discusses his marriages, it looks like, the book does, I guess. I mean, I've seen clips of the film, but not the whole thing. But seems to cover his cocaine bust, the murder stuff, Paramount. I'm sure it provides a nice glossy finish over it all. But the producer of this film is a fellow by the name of, where did it go? Brent Morgan. Nope. That's the director. Stand by 1 second here. I will let you know. I know I just was reading about this the other day. It's not listed on the Wikipedia, though. The source of all information on the interwebs apparently forgot this one. So Airmail is owned by a private equity firm, TCG Capital, but it was founded by a guy by the name of, I think he still works there. Yes. This fella. Graydon Carter, I believe is his name. Let's see here. Before I get way too far off topic, I know there was a Bob Cocaine connection to that biopic film, though. And no, I will have to say stand by for the next installment of my Idaho 4 Parapolitics series, because I'll go over that one. But there is an Airmail connection between the that series that Howard Blum is writing, again, the chief propagandist, this Airmail company, and old Cocaine Bob. So I will have to get back to you on what that is, folks, through the interwebs. But this it is the nature of these propagandas that we don't understand these topics, whether it be Idaho 4, whether it be the Process Church, whether it be all this Satanism stuff, or whether it be all of this cocaine trafficking, drug running, gun running, human trafficking, right? We had a Ted Wyatt, Cocaine Bob score 4 sex trafficked murder victim here on tonight's program. It is all these things that I think are rooted around the same network and are stamped national security, be it Iran-Contra, be it Idaho-Contra. These are the same stamping matters, if you will. So it is that stamping matters that of national security that causes us as general public to not to be able to understand these things. And thereby eradicating that free speech I was talking about earlier, back in that Nazi movement of the National Security Act of 1947. So it is that it eradicated free speech. It is these things of stamping things where we can't understand it. We don't have the information. How could we understand it? And it's strange. I don't even think 6 months ago I was looking at Idaho Contra. It wasn't even 6 months ago I was looking at the Gooch. It wasn't until some folks of the interwebs pointed out the Gooch had given an interview describing all these details, connections, and the seminal event of the Sharon Tate murders. Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojciech Frykowski. They're in the Tate Polanski house in Benedict Canyon in the Hollywood Hills, there by the Manson family. We don't understand who did that. I mean, Or were they there? Were they responsible? Were they in this drug trafficking network? Did they do sex magic rituals at that home? Sure. According to federal investigations, double Sirhan of RFK murders. He's according to investigatory reports, he was doing sex magic rituals at the Tate Polanski house preceding the RFK murder. And again, more Tate Polanski stuff around that because they had dinner with RFK the night before he was murdered. Tate Polanski, that is. So, nonetheless, I do, it is these activities that I think are the organizing principle with these folks, the sex magic, the drug, sex, and rock and roll. And that was Bob Cocaine Evans' lifestyle. Drug, sex, and rock and roll. In fact, some of the stories you can hear about him from his sexual proclivities, especially later in life, it gets fucking weird. I'm not doing that stuff tonight, though. We're not getting into that. But nonetheless, it is the result of. I appreciate folks on the interwebs bringing such like that to my attention. Where, someone sent me the link where the Gooch is talking about how her dad's all associated with all these activities and how she wasn't allowed to go once they moved to Idaho. She couldn't go back to school at Berkeley, university in the Bay Area because, all the Manson family stuff. Her father wouldn't let her. So she marks those events as a seminal event in her law enforcement career too. So, it's very odd, to have all that stuff connected across multiple decades, large geographical areas. And then it's even stranger to have, what seems to be this, an effort of Iran, what we call Iran-Contra, which we don't fully understand and no one was fully held accountable for. Many folks they walked Cocaine Bob style. They walked on the gun charges. They walked on the drug charges. They walked on all sorts of shit. But the long and the short of it is it's those activities that seem to still go on and perpetrate across our society and culture from the days of Iran-Contra onto our present era. And one of the early dominoes in Iran-Contra, again, I think Bob Cocaine Evans had his roles in such activities, again, being involved in the Medellin drug cartel network and around the Roy Raiden murders out there in Los Angeles. This is the time when that same network and that same Iran-Contra operations are funneling in, maybe not the same cocaine, but other Medellin cocaine for sure, into a fellow by the name of Rick Ross there in Compton, South Central Los Angeles, who would start the crack epidemic in around this very same time with the same Medellin coke. So I have to wonder, well, maybe not the same Medellin coke, but again, coke of the Central American Medellin varieties, probably the same Medellin coke. Let's be honest. And where does Bob Cocaine Evans fall into that? We don't know. We don't know at all. But during that era, right before then, in around 1980 or 81, about the same time Bob got popped for cocaine trafficking along with his brother, a bank in Australia failed with the Green Beret at the helm of it as one of the co-directors. Green Beret, Special Operations Vietnam, CIA, Material Assistance Command type of fellow by the name of John Michael Hand. He would skirt charges. He would then make his way back to the lawyer that he ran that bank with. I think he committed suicide when the bank failed, that is. And the Ponzi scheme was out. The money laundering, Ponzi scheme, drug trafficking, Iran-Contra style operations was out. Again, this is before anyone was even considering Iran-Contra, but it's an early domino effect in that whole trafficking, money laundering network. Well, that fellow hightailed his way up to Idaho, hid there for the next 25 years or so, undetected, until the CIA Green Beret fellow, that is, from Nugan Hand Bank, John Michael Hand. He would hide out there until some Australian journalist would find him about 2015 and say, "Hey, you're still alive." Apparently everyone thought he was dead down in Australia. No one in America knew he was. He had a hiding out under an assumed name in Idaho, right? Extensive money laundering for these spook operations of, stamping national security style, of Kissinger and gang. So what I'm saying is it seems to be these activities never really seem to have gone away. Things have never really been held accountable. A lot of folks have walked, like Leon Black. Again, not a direct association to Cocaine Bob, but certainly a direct association to the Idaho Contra stuff going on up there, who was involved in Iran-Contra himself, Leon Black, who paid off over $200 million to Epstein victims. Epstein victims like Ghislaine Maxwell, who's got a Cocaine Bob score of 3, through Barry Diller and Chelsea Clinton and gang and Ted Waite. And again, there's a sex trafficking victim that's photographed with Ted Waite. Again, maybe not an Epstein Maxwell one, but someone trafficked that young girl. Someone murdered that young girl. No one solved it. Just like no one solves Iran-Contra. No one solves Apparently, Idaho Contra, we just decide to violate the rights of a innocent individual named Brian Koberger and declare he's a murderer, and that there's no other criminality going on in that area. How dare you folks think there's money laundering, drug trafficking, gun operations, human trafficking, and all sorts of other hood rat shit happening in such a nice, very peaceful, very idyllic town of Moscow, Idaho. If you think that, I think you folks are the problems. I'm right there with you. I'd be the problem in that scenario too. But I'm obviously being facetious because that's such a nice town. There would be no way there'd be this cocaine trafficking, money laundering, human trafficking, drug trafficking situations of Iran Contra style going on with Iran Contra people like Leon Black in and around Moscow, Idaho, and what I like to call Idaho Contra. But I would say old Cocaine Bob's friends aren't too far from anything, be it, with the connections to the Gooch there in Idaho and that Howard Bloom connection through airmail, which I will most certainly be updating folks this Friday on The Purge, actually. Kane B's The Purge with my next Idaho update. So appreciate folks of the interwebs time this evening here on our fun-filled adventure in helping aid humanity and solving actor Kevin Bacon's dilemmas to find a new patsy in the 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. Tonight's character, of course, not Charles Manson, but his buddy is at least, 2 degree separation associate there. He's, Manson's got at least a Cocaine Bob score of 2. That is, old Cocaine Bob, I think, equally fits this fun-filled game of finding Kevin Bacon a new patsy. So appreciate folks of the interwebs joining me here tonight, and I wish I could pay attention to the chat and maintain these narratives in my brain hole at the same time. I'm simply not that talented. However, I do appreciate folks' conversation in the chat when I was able to check in, and definitely appreciate the comments and activities and chiming in with amongst yourselves with some of these details. Again, hope folks take away some information here tonight, other than just this vast amount of cocaine trafficking and other hood rat shit. But it doesn't seem to end, folks. It doesn't seem to end. The show's going to end, but the cocaine and the drug stuff and Bob Cocaine Evans and friends, they don't seem to end.
Well, that's it. That's the show here, folks. So the next time you're out on the town, visiting your local watering holes, or perhaps just meandering around, and you hear the unmistakable sounds of metal clanking, and you spot signs of a disturbance, but check your 6. Look in that garbage can, 'cause you never can tell. The GCDs may be loose in your town.